All right, so this is the Delirium end deck for Legacy. So the idea is that you are using the card Bloodbraid Marauder to cascade into Living End, bring a bunch of stuff back, and then the rest of the deck is mostly used to support that. So Bloodbraid is a 2-mana 3/1 can't block, and if you have Delirium, it cascades when you cast it. So the rest of the deck is set up for that. So you've got Dazed Force of Will for counters, Animate Dead, Grief, Street Wraith, Troll, Colossal Sky Turtle, etc. So you got a bunch of creatures that you can cycle into your graveyard just like you can in Modern Living End. And then the idea is to achieve Delirium through a bunch of cards, like Once Upon a Time, that is going to be a free card some of the time, Sky Turtle, which is also an enchantment, Architects of Will, which is also an artifact. Incubation Incongruity is a sorcery, usually when you're casting it, Once Upon a Time an instant, and then you've got Wail of the Forgotten. So unfortunately, when I ran this league, I forgot to unmute my mic for every single match all the way up until match 5, and nobody in the chat said anything until then. So I'm doing this voiceover after the fact. So if it doesn't exactly match what's going on, hopefully I get it pretty close to narrating the matchups or so. Incubation Incongruity, 1 mana, look at the top 5, get a creature. Wail of the Forgotten is you either bounce an on-land permanent, make a player discard or opponent discard, or look at the top 3, put 1 in hand, put the rest in the graveyard, and if you have 8 or more permanents in your graveyard, you can do all the modes or any number of the modes rather than only one. Sideboard Dismember for creatures, Shriekmaw for creatures, Fairy Macabre for graveyards, Oof Foundation Breaker, and Force of Vigor for artifact enchantment decks, and then Assassin's Trophy as just a general agnostic use removal spell for whatever we need to hit. So mostly all in on the Delirium plan. Sometimes you can grief an opponent and then Animate Dead it on turn 2 to double grief them, but mostly it is all in on the Living End plan. So round number 1, we are on the draw. Opening hand is acceptable with a Once Upon a Time in the hand, because we can use that to get to the second land. We also can grief and potentially Animate Dead on turn 2 to grief again. We also have Force of Will to interact with the opponent. So opponent plays Delta. We drew the second land anyway, so that's going to help in getting to what we need to do. So Once Upon a Time, grabbing Delta, and play Delta because we don't want to allow ourselves to get wastelanded if we don't have to. Opponent plays Scrubland. All right, so now we can double grief them. So exile, Wail, grief, see what they're working with. So opponent has Ephemerate, Lingering Souls, Reanimate, and Samwise, as well as a Wasteland in their hand, which is pretty weird. So the issue with the hand right now is that obviously we don't want to take Lingering Souls, and if we take Sam, they can just reanimate it next turn, unless we take Reanimate as well. So the Sam also has this thing of, like, if we don't take Sam, they can flash it in now and get their Delta back, or they can also Wasteland next turn twice. So we want to make them not be able to do that. So we need to take Sam and Reanimate so that they don't have any of that plan. And then if they really want to play Lingering Souls, they can. That unfortunately leaves us in a position, though, where they're going to get to Lingering Souls twice, and all we're going to have is a grief with an Animate Dead on it, which makes it a 2/2. And then they get to trade 2 of their souls for the grief, and then they get to make 2 more souls. But ultimately, the pick does have to be Sam plus Reanimate. So yeah, we've got our grief, we got our Animate Dead, we take Sam, we take Reanimate. So they opted not to cast Lingering Souls, and instead to Wasteland, and then they had another Reanimate off the top. So we have to Force of Will the Reanimate so that they can't Sam back and then grab the second Wasteland. So attack for 2. And then they didn't draw the land for Lingering Souls. So at this point, we have a Living End in our hand that's basically a dead card, so we may as well just grief them. And their hand has a grief in it. So once again, obviously, we don't want to take Lingering Souls, so we take their grief. And then we don't have anything else going on, so we're just going to Animate Dead the grief back and then take the Ephemerate out of their hand and just leave them with Lingering Souls. So they draw Wasteland. They have their third land. They get to play Lingering Souls. And then this matchup turns into a long, drawn-out cripple fight. So Souls trade for grief number 1. We've got nothing. They've got nothing. Play the Bayou. Then Lingering Souls flashback, Wasteland, one of our things. So, I mean, we can choose not to attack, but there's really no point. We attack, they trade. And then we have nothing much else to do other than just cycle the Troll, so pass to them. So they do nothing. End of turn. Troll, go get an Underground Sea. We drew Incubation Incongruity, which if we find Bloodbraid Marauder, we do have the Delirium, but we unfortunately somehow brick on Incubation. So back to them. Then they do nothing, and then we happen to top deck Bloodbraid after all of that. So they have a grief and a Sam in their yard, but we have better stuff than they do. So Cascade, hit Living End, and then they conceded to that. So our board was Grief, Troll, Bloodbraid. Their board was Sam Grief, and they had nothing to take. So here, it seems like they're Reanimator based. I mean, they're running Reanimate, so obviously Fairy Macabre. And then after that, it's unclear as to what exactly you should bring in. So I ultimately opted to cut all the Force of Wills because it seems like they're not really a combo deck. They're more of like a synergy value deck. And against that, you don't want Force of Will. You don't want a 2-for-1 yourself. And they've got a bunch of spells that are like not even good to counter anyway. So opening hand is only 1 land, but we've got Troll to cycle. Unfortunately, they Thoughtseize us immediately. And they, of course, took Troll. So that just leaves us with a Street Wraith to cycle with and 1 land. We drew Living End, which is the worst draw in our deck. And that just leaves us with a single mana and Daze. So let's go ahead and Grief them. And their hand is Him, Mana Tithe, Swords to Plowshares. So we don't care about Mana Tithe or Swords, so we take one of the Hymns. So they untapped and Thoughtseized us rather than hymning. So we can't do anything about that. So the Thoughtseize resolves. They take one of the Dazes. And then it's back to us. We can't cast Once Upon a Time. So back to them. They drew Wasteland. Then they hymn us, and unfortunately we're in a position where even if we daze this, they can either pay for it or not pay for it and just wasteland us anyway, so there's really no move here other than just the hymn resolve. We discard Whale and Once Upon a Time, then they wasteland us, and their hands monetize Swords, and we're not doing anything either, so we're just kind of, once again, in a cripple fight. So triple Scrubland, we're not doing anything, cycle Architects of Will, here's another Daze, back to them. They play a land, back to us. We draw off 3 Dazes. Horrible against their board of 5 mana sources. Second mana source. If we cast Whale, they get to monetize it. We're kind of not doing anything else, though. So cast Whale. They monetize it. They fetch to thin their deck. They don't do anything. We drew another Whale, so we're going to do the same thing. Top 3, Grief, Fairy Macabre, Sky Turtle, none of which are really very helpful here. So ultimately, I opt for Macabre just because if we eventually get on the Delirium Cascade plan, we want to be able to potentially take stuff out of their yard. We untap and draw Animate Dead. Unfortunately, since they have Swords to Plowshares in their hands, there's nothing that we can really Animate Dead that's that good. So the best option is animating Grief to take one of their cards, and then they're forced to use Swords on it, or we just take... Alternatively, we can animate Architects of Will to potentially set up a Delirium, and that is what I ultimately chose. So Architects of Will, and then we're going to target ourselves to try to get to Bloodbraid. So top cards are Fetch Land, Once Upon a Time, so I'm going to put them in the order of Fetch, Once, Fetch. Opponent does nothing, so now we get to just attack them for 2 with this Architect. We're not going to fetch because we want to draw the Once Upon a Time that's on top of our deck. They don't do anything, so back to us, we attack them, we fetch. So we need a green source, we grab Taiga. I want Taiga specifically because if they draw another Wasteland, I want to have red mana in case of Bloodbraid Marauder. They drew another land. So I unfortunately misclicked there. I meant to cast Once Upon a Time, but just didn't. So that was unfortunate. Cycle the Troll, play a land, go. Then it's back to them. They just drew another land. So end of turn once. We do find the Bloodbraid. And we're in a position now where basically they're not pressuring us at all, and we can just keep hitting them with this Architect. None of our creatures have haste anyway, so we may as well hit them. And the one thing I'm worried about here is if they have Containment Priest. Because if they have Containment Priest and we Bloodbraid right now, we lose everything. So the fact that they're not doing anything and they have so many cards in their hand is leading me to think that they possibly have Containment Priest. So if they're not going to interact with us, I can just go ahead and keep hitting them. And even though we have triple Daze, we can't use it to stop the Priest because they have so much mana. It is possible, though, that I should have just gone for it immediately. But anyways, the plan now is to Sky Turtle the Grief back to our hand so we can Grief them, see if they have the Containment Priest, and then if they don't, then we can Bloodbraid. In response, they Surgical the Grief. There is the possibility that I can Fairy Macabre my own Grief here to prevent them from 1, taking the other Grief, and 2, seeing both our hand and deck. I ultimately decided, though, that it's not worth it. They can just go ahead and Surgical the Grief. And the fact that they're playing Surgical leads me to believe that it's less likely that they have Containment Priest. So attack, they go to 5, and at this point, we're just going to go ahead and cast Bloodbraid. So cast Living End. And as it turns out, they did not have Containment Priest, but they did have Fairy Macabre. So they get 2 of our guys. And then in response, before the Living End resolves, I'm going to Fairy Macabre their Fairy Macabre. 1, so that they don't get a creature back, and 2, so I get an additional creature back. And then in response to this, I'm also cycling the Troll. Because I think the fact that they have Fairy Macabre plus Surgical means it's very, very unlikely that they have Containment Priest. So that allows us to resolve all of this, and we get to have a board of Marauder, Macabre, Street Wraith, 3 Trolls. And we have triple Daze open, which is probably not relevant, but is fine. Opponent Swords, the Troll. They're probably only out here is a Wrath. They Swords another Troll. They tapped 4 mana, which I was very concerned was going to be Damnation, but it's not. It's a Grief. And ultimately, we win the match. So on to round 2. So round 2, we're on the play. And the opening hand is fine. We've got a turn 2 animate dead on the grief. We've got a force of will. We can cycle architects of will. We can cast incubation. Hand's fine. So just play a tap land in case I want to use force of will. So they played Putrid Imp, which I'm not exactly sure what that is, but Putrid Imp is an enabler, so obviously probably their deck revolves around that, so I opt to force of will it. So force of will, get rid of incubation, and that way we have the architects. Now, I actually meant to cycle the architects, but I forgot, but that's ultimately going to pay off because it will allow us to grief and then animate dead on the grief. Unfortunately, turns out their deck is madness, so they've got Root Wall, Kitchen Imp, Vengevine, Faithless Looting. So obviously we're supposed to take Faithless Looting. But then the question after that is, so basically we have two options here. One, we can take Looting as their enabler. Two, we could take Vengevine and then instead of griefing, animate dead on Vengevine, so that way they don't have it. But I decided that probably it's unlikely that they're going to have that. So I took Faithless Looting as their enabler, and then I decided that there was nothing else in their hand that I really wanted to get rid of. If I take Vengevine, it's just in their graveyard, which they want anyway. If I take Root Wall, they get to cast it for free. So the other option is to take Kitchen Imp, and taking Kitchen Imp didn't seem that good either. So I decided not to do anything here. Unfortunately, this is going to extremely bite me in the ass. So it turns out they top decked another Putrid Imp. And that will allow them to cast everything. So they bin the Vengevine, they get to cast Root Walla, which is a second creature cast, which allows them to get Vengevine back. And then they also get to put Kitchen Imp into play, so they get everything into play. Then we're way behind. So my best option at this point is just to cycle Street Wraith and animate it. So cycle Street Wraith, we have Bloodbraid, but we don't have Delirium for it. So now the move is we need to animate dead a creature that is able to block them, and then use that creature to block and have their creatures survive while ours does not, so that animate dead can go to the graveyard so we can get an enchantment into our graveyard so we can get Delirium. So ultimately I opted to animate dead on their Putrid Imp. That way we can chump block their Vengevine and then Living End the next turn. So animate dead on the Putrid Imp, then it's back to them. There is the possibility that they just keep attacking with flying creatures only, but that seems unlikely. So they play a land. They do attack with everything. So Putrid Imp blocks the Vengevine. We go to 4. Then we get an enchantment into our graveyard. And then we get to Bloodbraid, Cascade into Living End. Everything of theirs dies. And then Putrid Imp comes back. And we get Grief Street Wraith. They have no cards in their hand, so Grief is irrelevant. And now, unfortunately, they have 6 cards in their graveyard, so anything that they draw, they can jump the Putrid Imp. So they can discard, attack with the Putrid Imp, which has flying and gets +1 for Threshold, put us to 2, and then they can just discard a card again on the next turn. But ultimately, they opted not to do that. They opted to just flashback Faithless Looting. So Faithless Looting discards Once Upon a Time Wasteland, and now the Putrid Imp can't block, and they still have a card in their hand and opted not to discard it. So we draw Days, we have Once Upon a Time. This is not really helping. So I'm looking at this and thinking, okay, they're at 19. I can't really race them here. So I want to put myself in a position where I'm not going to just die to Vengevine if they get it back, but I still need to put a clock on them. So attack with everything, and now they have Putrid Imp as a 2/2, because I'm still in a position where they can just discard, jump the Putrid Imp flying, and then ultimately leave me dead anyway. So I want to have the Sky Turtle to bounce the Imp, and then be able to race them. So I'm looking at them at 10. I can put them to 1, but that doesn't kill them. So I need to leave 1 creature back so that I can pitch the Sky Turtle to bounce the Putrid Imp, and I can have 1 blocker in case they manage to double creature spell into Vengevine. Unfortunately, I forgot that Bloodbraid Marauder can't block, and that was the creature that I left behind. And ultimately, it turns out they are in fact able to cast Anji's Ravager, Putrid Imp, discard Hollow One, bring Vengevine back, and then I can't block. So multiple things went wrong there. First of all, they could have just killed us by jumping their Putrid Imp 2 turns in a row. Secondly, I had to make the mistake of not only leaving the Bloodbraid back as a blocker, which can't block, but I also made the mistake of not just bouncing Putrid Imp immediately, which enabled them to cast Anji's Ravager off of Madness. So bring in Fairy Macabre so that we can eat Vengevines that come out really quickly. Also has secondary utility in terms of getting rid of Faithless Lootings that are in the yard. But ultimately, everything else is not really that great. So opted to get rid of Wail of the Forgotten because it's just not very good against what they're doing. And unfortunately, they have Leyline of the Void in their opener, which totally screws us, and I didn't board in any cards to deal with that. Not only did I not board in any cards to deal with it, I boarded out all the Wail of the Forgotten. So we basically are completely dead this game. Can't Living End at all. Can't animate dead any of our guys. and essentially have no way of getting rid of Leyline of the Void. So opponent gets Wasteland, then Wasteland's our thing, so we just cycle Architects because we got nothing better to do. So play a land, cast Incubation, find Grief because it's the only pick, back to them. I could have cast Grief, I opted not to because we need more lands off the Troll. So they cast Putrid Imp, we daze it, then cycle Street Wraith. We have an Animate Dead, so all the cards in our hand are just basically dead cards. They play second land, cycle the Troll, go get another land. So our only real play here is reanimate their own thing. So I decided to Animate Dead Street Wraith. So we have a 2/4 Street Wraith that they can't block. Unfortunately, they once upon a time into Inti, which in this game is going to single-handedly win them the game. So Inti, and our Street Wraith is getting a reduced power because of Animate Dead, so we can't block the Inti. They get to Faithless Looting, which triggers the Inti. They loot away Blazing Rootwalla. They get Vengevine back, or they try to at least. We use Fairy Macabre to get rid of it. And now, unfortunately, we're in a position where we just don't have anything, and they are able to attack with both Inti and Blazing Rootwalla in a way that we can't actually block them. So the Rootwalla attacks, the Inti triggers, it discards Anger, of all things, exiles a mountain, and now if we block the Rootwalla, it trades, but we don't have anything better to do, so pays the mana, Rootwalla, and then once upon a time, grab Troll, cycle the Troll, and we have nothing else to do, so we just hard cast a Grief. They bolt it, which means we don't have a blocker for Inti. They had no other cards in their hand other than lands, so the Grief did actual nothing. Then they discard a land, exile a land, play the land for free, and now their Inti's a 3/3. We have nothing going on. We can't Living End because we have no creatures in our yard, and they do. So even if we suspend it at this point, it's completely worthless. So I take a Street Wraith off the Once Upon a Time, and there's nothing to do with it either. It can't block the Inti. So my only possible out is to draw Sky Turtle so I can bounce Inti to reset the counters on it, and then have Street Wraith as a blocker. They loot, they discard, they get Rootwalla back. They gamble, which also the discard triggers Inti. They get Faithless Looting, they cast Faithless Looting, which triggers Inti. They put Vengevine in their yard, they cast Putrid Imp, they get Vengevine. I Once Upon a Time trying to get Fairy Macabre, which I do. Fairy Macabre, eat the Vengevine, and then it's a debate whether I should hit Anger or Faithless Looting. They have 2 lootings in their yard anyway, so I ultimately opt to just hit Anger so that they can't attack me this turn with Rootwalla. Doesn't matter, they get Putrid Imp, and the last card in their hand was Hollow One. So now Inti gets to attack, and Inti's a 3/3, Hollow One's a 4/4, Rootwalla can become a 3/3, and all of those creatures can get pumped by Inti's trigger, so even playing a Street Wraith doesn't block anything. So cycle the Street Wraith, we have 2 Living Ends and a land, we're dead. Round 3, we're on the draw. We have to mull. This hand looks initially like a mull, but we do have 2 Street Wraiths to cycle and a Once Upon a Time to try to find a land, so it's keepable. Opponent ponders. We draw Force of Will, so we cycle the Street Wraith, we draw Volcanic, we cycle the Street Wraith again, we draw another land. So we have 2 lands. So now it's just a matter of, do I want to cast Incubation or do I want to cycle Architects? So Once Upon a Time, we get Bloodbraid Marauder. We have 2 types in our yard, which will soon become more. If I cycle the Architects, then I have nothing to pitch Grief to. So I ultimately decide to cycle, and then we draw Daze. They cast Ponder. They cast Stalactite Stalker, which is a 1/1 with Menace that on end step, if you had a permanent go into your graveyard from anywhere, it gets +1 counter. You can also pay 3, sack it, and target creature gets -X, where X is its power. So fetch lands count, so it becomes a 2/2 with Menace. We drew Wail of the Forgotten. We are 1 type away from being able to Living End, so we can't do it now. So ultimately decide to evoke Grief, see what they're on. And they are in fact the Murktide Tempo deck. So their hand is Murktide, Ponder, Reanimate. So obviously we don't want to put Murktide in their yard because it just comes back off Living End. And if they cast a Murktide, we get to Living End it away. The Reanimate, it could be a problem if they reanimate one of our own things. So I decided to take Reanimate. Then I need to get another type into my yard, so for next turn. So cast Incubation, which gets a sorcery into the yard. Finds a Troll, which is great because the Troll will allow me to have yet another creature to reanimate. So Troll, grab a red land in case they draw Wasteland. We want to be able to have red mana for Bloodbraid Elf. They play Misty, they cast Ponder. They evoke Grief, which is an issue for Bloodbraid, so I'm forced to Force of Will it, because if I don't, then I lose Bloodbraid Marauder. So Force of Will the Grief, and then their hand is just 2 Murktides. So for some reason they conceded there, so maybe they know what we're on, I'm not sure. Anyways, not sure if they're playing Death Shadow or not, but they're definitely a, blue-black Murktide Tempo deck. So the trophies can kill their big creatures. None of the artifact enchantment removal is relevant unless they're running Leyline of the Void, but I'm not going to bring it in prematurely until I know they are. So that leaves basically Shriekmaw to potentially kill Murktide, and then the Assassin's Trophies to kill whatever, and maybe Fairy Macabre because they are also on a Grief Reanimate plan. So ultimately, I decided to bring in 2 trophies and Shriekmaw. And then I decided to bring in 1 Foundation Breaker just in case they have Leyline of the Void, pretty PTSD'd over the last Leyline of the Void match. And then in the grindy matchups, Force of Will is not really that good, so ultimately decided to cut Force of Will. Opening hand is Troll, Trophy, Street Wraith, Daze, 3 lands, keep it. They Delta, they play Stalactite Stalker, which becomes a 2/2, and then they decide to evoke Grief, which we can't respond to either. They took Trophy, so we don't have anything to do. I could have cycled Street Wraith there, probably should have, didn't. So they cycle a Troll. So end of their turn, we're going to fetch. We're going to cycle Troll, get a land, cycle the Street Wraith next turn. So cycle the Street Wraith. We got Wail the Forgotten. Seems better to cast that than do anything else. So Wail the Forgotten, top 3 cards. It resolves, and our top 3 are Architects, Once Upon a Time, Volcanic. So not the Bloodbraid Marauder, which is the card we want, but the Once Upon a Time can find it. We also get to cycle again off Architects. So pick the Once Upon a Time. They Brainstorm. They do have a Wasteland, so we have to be wary of that, but we have plenty of lands to compensate. They attack with Stalactite Stalker. They decide to Surgical our Wail of the Forgotten, which I find very confusing. It turns out they were trying to target Architects of Will and misclicked. So they waste our Trop. Stalactite becomes a 3/3. So cycle Street Wraith, we get Shriekmaw. Shriekmaw can't kill the Stalactite Stalker. So play a second land, and then we're going to try to Once Upon a Time for the Bloodbraid. So they Brainstorm. They Ponder. So end of turn, Once Upon a Time. We still missed the Bloodbraid Marauder. So that being the case, the cheapest way that we can find a new card is the Street Wraith, so we take the Street Wraith. So we've got Incubation, Incongruity, which is a way to potentially find the Bloodbraid Marauder, and yet still, we finally get the Bloodbraid Marauder. Cycle the Street Wraith, so cast Bloodbraid, trigger, even if they have their own daze, we can daze it back, or Force of Will. So cast Living End. So our board is Architect, Street Wraith, Street Wraith, Street Wraith, Troll, and they have Grief, Troll, and we have the Bloodbraid. So their top cards are Grief, Bowmasters, and Delta. So I don't want them to have access to Bowmasters, so I just put that on the bottom. They evoke a Grief, exiling a Troll from their hand. Take our Shriekmaw, which is odd, but okay. And then they play Murktide, which makes sense now. Unfortunately, this Murktide is a 7/7 with flying, which we can't block, so that kills us in 1 hit. And we're in a position where even if we attack with everything on our board, they will survive. So we have to draw an answer to Murktide. We draw an Architects, which the only course of action is to cycle it to try to find an answer to Murktide. So the only thing I'm wondering is, am I supposed to fetch the fetch land or cycle the Troll ahead of time? And it's basically what is in our deck. And we have 2 mana answers to Murktide in the form of Wail the Forgotten Assassin's Trophy and Colossal Sky Turtle, but we also have Incongruity as a way to turn the Murktide into a Frog Lizard, which is 3 mana. So ultimately, the best course of action is to fetch, then cycle, and see if we hit one of those cards. So we fetch, we cycle. Ultimately, we didn't hit, though, and we're in a position where they can block either everything on the Troll, or they can block Architects plus Bloodbraid Elf, and then they'll survive. Because we can deal them 15, and no matter the combination. So ultimately decide this is probably fine, except we probably don't need the Foundation Breaker. So I just bring a Fairy Macabre back. Opening hand, not very good. We mull. We have 1 land, 2 Once Upon a Times, double Grief, Fairy Macabre, Troll. So it's either put back Fairy Macabre once. I decided to put back Fairy Macabre. So cast Once Upon a Time, get the Troll. We want to keep hitting lands. They play Underground Sea. We fetch, grab Volcanic, cycle the Troll, grab Bayou, because we're missing green mana. So the only thing I'm debating here is, do I want a Once Upon a Time first? Because if I Once Upon a Time, obviously the card I want to get is Bloodbraid Marauder, but let's say I Once Upon a Time and there's not a Bloodbraid Marauder, but there's an Architects of Will. That would give me the option of double griefing, as opposed to right now where I'm going to potentially just pitch Grief to Grief. So Once Upon a Time first. There is no Bloodbraid, there is an Architects and other black cards. So I ultimately decided to take Fairy Macabre because I think it's the least useful card. Evoke Grief. Their hand is Bowmasters, Murktide, Daze, Grief. So if they grief us, that's not so big of a deal. The Murktide will eventually be a problem, but not right now. And the Daze is also not really a problem. The biggest problem is if they play Bowmaster. I could also evoke Grief twice, but that doesn't seem good either. The problem is they have a Wasteland in their hand. And if they have a Wasteland and we get rid of our Troll, then we're stuck on 1 mana. So we can't get rid of our Troll. Therefore, we cannot evoke the second Grief. Therefore, we only get 1 discard here. And if we only get 1 discard here, then the card I want to get rid of is Bowmasters. It's the only card that they can play aside from Daze, which I don't really care about. And the fact is, we have a lot of cards in our deck that draw more cards. All of our cycling cards draw more cards. So I don't want to allow them to have Bowmasters. Also, we just have no creatures in play because the Grief in play is going to die to evoke. So ultimately, the choice has to be Bowmasters. So take Bowmasters, they waste land, they immediately hit Volcanic Island. We happen to draw another land anyway, but I still think it's not important to Grief them here. So they play an Underground Sea, we cycle the Troll, we get a Badlands, we need a red mana in case we draw Bloodbraid, so Badlands, and then just have nothing to do at the moment, so pass. They Brainstorm, then they cast Stalactite Stalker, then they evoke Grief, exiling another Stalactite Stalker, and at this point the problem is if I Colossal Sky Turtle and regrow anything, they're just going to take that thing. Like, they're probably not going to take Grief. So if I don't regrow now, they just have the option of taking the turtle. And that leaves me with just playing Grief, which is maybe okay, but I ultimately think I just need to hit stuff. So I decide to get a land back. Maybe it would have been better to just hard chat, to just like leave them both there, and then if they take Grief, so be it. Or they'll just take the Sky Turtle. Anyway, we wind up drawing another Sky Turtle. So land go. In hindsight, it was probably better to have just Griefed them back and taken their Murktide, and then that would have left us with a blocker for Stalactite Stalker. So Sky Turtle on the end step to get Once Upon a Time back. Fetch in the deck. So now I know they have Daze, so the only question is, do I want to cast Once or do I want to cast Incubation? Either way, either card that I cast will leave me with enough mana to cast Bloodbraid Elf and then pay for Daze. So the only real question is which one is better. And the thing is that Incongruity can kill Murktide if that comes out next turn. So it has a little bit more utility than that. Ultimately, I decide to cast Incubation. There's some reasons for that. Like if I hit Grief, I want to be able to cast Grief and take something. Or I guess if I cast Grief, they can Daze it. But the point is, it doesn't exactly matter which one. Anyway, I do not hit the Bloodbraid Marauder. So that just leaves me with abilities to cycle. So I cycle Street Wraith. I still don't hit the Bloodbraid Marauder. I did find another land, but I am not in a position to Bloodbraid here. And I Once Upon a Time, and I still don't find a Bloodbraid Marauder. We are 20 cards deep into our deck, and we still have not found one single Bloodbraid Marauder. So take Architects of Will. Opponent reanimates on our Grief, which forces us to cycle. So we cycle, we hit Assassin's Trophy, we can't cast it, the Grief takes it, then we get hit, then we've got a Street Wraith, but it doesn't matter. They have, both guys have Menace. So fetch, cycle, we cast Grief. Their hand is Daze, Murktide, so we just take Murktide. Then they attack. Both their dudes have Menace. I can't block either one of them. Then we just draw Daze and lose the game. So amazingly, we went 25 cards deep into our deck and never found Bloodbraid Marauder. Thus, the loss. Round 4, we're on the draw. This hand is acceptable. It's got a bunch of interaction. So opponent goes Lotus Petal, Grief, exiling Grief. So is almost certainly Reanimator. Can't respond to this. Grief takes Incubation. Then they play Delta. Then they Faithless Looting. Put Verdant Thoughtseize in the yard. Then they reanimate Grief off their pedal and take Bloodbraid Marauder. So, they did take some of the stuff from our hand, but they don't really have anything going on. So they play Badlands, we fetch, we get a land, we set a troll, we get a land. Then we've got Wail of Forgotten, which is probably the best play in terms of trying to set up what we're doing. So Reanimator potentially has an issue if they put a huge creature in the yard and then we have to Living End, but they haven't so far. So Wail of Forgotten, get Bloodbraid Marauder, do not expose the red land to potential wasteland, even though they're probably not playing it, but never take that risk. They Faithless Looting, and I decide I've got to Daze this, because if they just Faithless Looting into like a Gristlebrand or something, then our Living End plan is boned. So Daze the Faithless. Then we've got our Bloodbraid, so their yard has no creatures in it, and our yard has Bloodbraid, Troll, Street Wraith, Architects. So cast the Bloodbraid, Living End, eat their dude. Their top cards are just Looting, Thoughtseize, Unmask, so put Faithless Looting third, and then the Hand Disruption after that. Unmask on top, they concede here. So it's Reanimator, so obviously we want Fairy Macabre. Other than that, nothing really. There's the option of maybe having Assassin's Trophy, but we do have ways of getting rid of anything big that they reanimate, so we don't necessarily need that. Ultimately, I decide Grief is probably not necessary because they have they dump their hand so quickly. So decide to board out Grief. So they swamp and tomb for a Gristlebrand and do nothing with it. We get to have Daze up. So they reanimate. I decide to fetch, grab an island, then Once Upon a Time first. If we hit Fairy Macabre, that will be a payoff. We did not, but we found Architects of Will, so we can cycle that. So cycle Architects of Will. We draw a Troll, and then we can Daze the Reanimate. So Reanimate gets Dazed. They do not have another mana to follow that up with. We happen to just draw Fairy Macabre, so that's a great draw. So Underground Sea returns. They try to reanimate again. We Fairy Macabre the Gristlebrand, then cycle Troll, get a land. Drew another Once Upon a Time. We have 4 types, and we can Bloodbraid and put Bloodbraid, Fairy Macabre, Troll, Architects into play. Seems good to me, so we Bloodbraid. The only way this goes wrong is if they have Entomb, and they did not. So Living End, get everything. Look at the top of their deck, which is actually probably not helpful because they can just fetch anyway, so probably should have targeted me and not them. Anyway, they decided not to fetch, so have nothing going on. We win the match. And then on to round number 5. So our hand is Daze, Once Upon a Time, Architects, 3 lands. Keep this. They have Verdant. Back to us. Play a fetch land. Go. Plays a Swamp. Fetch. Savannah into Tithe Taker, a card I have never seen once in Legacy. 2 mana, 2/1. Spells your opponent's cast cost 1 more during the opponent's turn. I decide that cannot resolve. Have to daze that. So Once Upon a Time for Street Wraith. Daze the Tithe Taker. We cycle Architects of Will. That goes away. Still not really sure what they're on at this point, so we just play a land past the turn. They're probably a Wasteland deck given they're the Abzan colors, and indeed there's the Wasteland. So they cast GSC for 2. I decide I probably have to daze that as well. So Trop, cycle Architects, daze it. So we're keeping them from doing much, but we are unfortunately constantly down on land. So cycle the Street Wraith. Then we have Grief. I decide I'm going to Grief a Troll away and see what it is they're working with. And then their hand is double Chain of Smog, Wasteland, Horizon Canopy. So they are an Abzan Wither Chain deck. So take one of the Smogs, Grief dies, and then we're in a position where they have yet another Wasteland in their hand. So just play Polluted Delta. This way, hopefully we can animate dead something. So they Chain of Smog us, and we're not going to rise to the bait, because the problem is if we redirect it to them, they're losing a hand of mostly useless cards, whereas they get to redirect it to us, and we lose everything. So we just have that happen. So we're going to lose the Troll, because we want the Troll in our graveyard anyway, and we're going to lose a land. So opt to get rid of Tropical Island, and then not copy the Chain of Smog. So Street Wraith is our draw. We cycle, we hit Incubation. We could animate dead something here, but they have 2 cards in hand, one of which is Horizon Canopy, which doesn't seem particularly great. So ultimately, we're just going to incubate. We do find the Bloodbraid Marauder. They Wasteland our Underground Sea. Then they cast GSC for 2, and they find Witherbloom Apprentice. Doesn't matter, because we're going to be able to Living End that. So grab that. Bloodbraid, Cascade, Living End. Their guy dies, they get a Tithe Taker, we get all of this that you see in front of you, so quite a lot. So there's a Wither Chain deck, so we want things that obviously kill Witherbloom Apprentice. So I bring in Dismember, and then after that, I wasn't really sure what to take out. The prime candidate, like Wail of the Forgotten, is a big one, because just bouncing their stuff at sorcery speed doesn't seem very good. So ultimately, I opted to cut 1 Animate Dead and 2 Wail of the Forgottens. Opening hand is decent, and then boom, fucked over once again by Leyline of the Void. And we cut 2 of our whales, so we have even fewer ways of getting rid of it. They're also a deck that is fully capable of just casting a Leyline. Anyways, they play Ignoble Hierarch on turn 1, and we just really don't have much going on. So Once Upon a Time, there's the Bloodbraid Marauder, but it doesn't matter now because Leyline is around. And the problem is, once Leyline is in play, we really have to either deal with it, or our deck is super slow and bad. So this game is just going to deteriorate pretty quickly. So Evoke Grief, their hand is GSC, GSC, Monetithe, so take GSC. And then I decide, well, I'm not doing anything with this stuff anyway, so let's just evoke the second Grief, take the GSC, and then we'll leave them with just Monetithe land and us with nothing either. So they get Xantid Swarm, attack for 1. We just draw a land. I meant to play the Taiga there. The reason I didn't is because they just have Monetithe anyway, but I should have played Taiga in case they tapped out. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. So Taiga, back to them. They can keep hitting for 1 with the Xantid Swarm, so in response to the trigger, cast Once Upon a Time. The only options are Bayou and Bloodbraid, and since the Bloodbraid isn't really doing anything, it's the option between having a 3/1 or just another land. And ultimately, I think I should have probably just taken the Bloodbraid to try to race them, but I took Bayou. The idea being that I could eventually get to Troll, and they're only dealing 1 damage a turn anyway. So we draw Incubation and Congruity. So we're going to cast Incubation. We bricked on it really bad, so play a land. The Troll is not doing much for us anyway, so we're just holding the Troll. They keep hitting us with Xantid Swarm. They thought seize the Troll away. I accidentally F6 through that, and they just took the Troll. But ultimately, it's not going to matter. So we draw Sky Turtle. We can't do anything with that either. Can't get anything back from our graveyard. Bouncing any of their creatures is pointless. So they attack with the Xantid Swarm. We're dying very, very slowly. They GSC for 1, not even 2, to grab another Hierarch, which kind of confuses me. Surprised they don't have anything better to get than just another Hierarch, but so be it. So grab a land. We drew another land. Now they're hitting for 2 a turn off the Xantid Swarm with the double Exalted. So they Wasteland us. We take a bunch of damage. Fetch. Get a land. Wail of the Forgotten, which again is not really doing anything here. Even if we bounce Leyline of the Void, they can just replay it. So look at the top 3. And the top 3 is Living End, Grief. The Living Ends, the Grief is not going to do anything because the Xantid Swarm flies and we can't race them. So the only other option is Living End and then try to suspend it next turn, but we're probably going to die before that. So the idea is we'll Living End and then we will Colossal Sky Turtle the Xantid Swarm. They play Paladin class, which is an Anthem that is going to completely screw us, but for whatever reason, they decide not to use the Paladin class. Maybe they're holding Mana Tithe up. It seems dubious considering we have 5 mana, but they decided not to activate it. So back to me, I really should have bounced the Xantid Swarm at this point before taking damage. I didn't, which is going to leave me in a position where we're going to take too much. But ultimately, that's not going to matter either. So we drew Daze, so we're just going to suspend Living End, then it's back to them. They replay Ignoble. For some reason, yet again, they do not activate Paladin class. So we go to 3, and then we're going to just die in 1 turn. We draw an Architects of Will, which even if we play it, it can't even block the Xantid Swarm. So cycle the Architects, we draw a Troll, we can't play the Troll, and we're dead to Paladin class. So for the sideboard, I decided that I had originally kept around Daze and Force of Will because I figured, well, they're the Wither Chain combo deck, I need these cards, but they not only have, it seems like their deck has a lot of mana, especially with Mana Dork, so the Daze isn't good, and then they just have a lot of playing on the board. So Xantid Swarm, Paladin class, Tithe Taker, lots of things that tax instant speed spells. So I decided I should play to the board rather than try to counter everything. So just bring in a whole bunch of removal. So like Assassin's Trophy, Foundation Breaker to get rid of Leyline of the Void, Shriek Maw to kill their guys. So that's what I brought in and cut all the counter spells. So we start, we have double Dismember, Troll, Street Wraiths, Tie Turtle. Ultimately, they have the turn 1 Leyline again, which means nothing that we're doing matters until we can get rid of it. They play a Hierarch, so we're going to dismember that. Take a whole bunch of damage doing it, but it's better to get rid of it now. Over to us. Play the Black Land so that if we have to dismember, we can at least pay for some of it. They play Noble Hierarch. They don't do anything else. We dismember the Noble Hierarch. Back to us. We still can't do anything. We're just drawing lands. Back to them. They Thoughtseize us, and I decide not to do anything in response to that. They take Sky Turtle, and they play Witherbloom Apprentice. We've still got nothing. I decide the Troll is going to be too long to matter. Like, it's going to be too late in the game by the time that actually matters. So we actually drew the Foundation Breaker. So hard cast the Foundation Breaker, eat the Leyline. We're dead to a Smog, but thankfully they did not draw the Smog. And at this point, someone in the chat finally said to, hey, is your mic off? And yes, indeed, my mic was off. So this resumes the actual audio from the league. Oh my gosh, I had the mic muted all this night. That's not good. Thank you for pointing that out. Oh, that's going to make this whole league an issue, isn't it? Witherbloom Apprentice. All right, well, at least we're not dead. Play Architect and then screw up their draw? Because they clearly don't have Chain, or I could save my own draw. I could try to fix my own draw. All right, first things first, attack them. All right, let's play Architect and let's fix our own. Okay, Bloodbraid, we have 1, not enough. Actually, all of these are bad, right? All of them. I guess the Whale isn't really bad. Okay, so I don't want to draw Grief, so that's last. This can filter me into things that I need and set up for Bloodbraid. So let's send that second, and then that's the over to the cycle. All right, draw. So Whale, cast. Look at the top 3. We need to have red open to cast Bloodbraid, maybe. Although there's no way we're gonna put. No, actually, we're only putting 3 cards in the yard, so we're not gonna have. We're not gonna have it. What do I need? Not red, black, and actually, I haven't even played Taiga yet. Okay, take the Bloodbraid and the other. All right, let's just not take unnecessary damage. I guess actually, if I attack with the Architects and they double block it, which I doubt they would do, but let's say they do, then that gets an artifact into my yard, and then I can actually do it. So let's attack with just there's no way they block, right? Yeah, okay. Well, it was nice to try. Wasteland. Oh, I think they might have it. All right, Xantid Swarm attacks. Yeah. Can't cast spell. Well, it's not Chain because they're paying GSZ for Gadok T. So non-creep is 4 greater and X cast, which my spells aren't fetch. Do I have a second? They just don't have a reason to attack me. Grief. All right. Black. All right. What do they have in their hand? 2 Paladins. We take 1. So let's say I attack with this, right? And then they attack back. They're not going to attack again. So let's just keep hitting them with swing. My Living End is not even that good right now, right? I only have a Grief in my graveyard, and they have 2 Hierarchs rather. It's actually bad for me if I Living End right now. Xantid and Gadok are attacking. Does that mean they want me to block because they have, what X spell do they have? GSC, I guess? It's just GSE. That's the only one, right? Like, if they have GSE, sure. Block the trade with Gadok. Plays another Xantid. Okay, so they didn't. They were just attacking. Oh boy. All right, I don't have the time, do I? I just hit them as fast as possible. If I play both Marauders right now, I guess that puts a clock on. And we don't die to anything that they can play on their turn, presumably. If I attack, let's say I attack and they do block Architects, would I want to Living End in that situation? I don't think I would, right? Because then their graveyard would be Hierarch, Gadok, a Witherbloom. And my graveyard would be Foundation Breaker, Grief, Architect. So let's play them pre-combat and then attack. So this, combat, chumping with Xantid. All right, if at any point they just draw Smog off the top, we're dead. They did not. They did finally find white mana for Paladin class, but at this point I think it's probably right. They can play it, but then they can't activate it until next turn. So Paladin class it. If we attack, they have to block a creature. What creature can I draw here that matters before combat goes on? All right. Once I didn't have an instant in before, right? So if I grab a Bloodbraid, then I'm allowing Living End to go off. If I cast that, I guess it's better than just having the troll though. Combat, swing, everything. So they're gonna block 2, and then they're gonna try to draw Smog off the we can't do anything about. All right, 1 draw. Do they get Smog? 4 mana. GSE for 3K. Endurance. That doesn't matter. They're still dead in attacks. We attack with everything they can't block in a way that die. All right. Well, 3 and 2. So I don't know what to say about this deck. I think I would need to play it a lot more to fully to see how actually good it is. It feels so far not as good as tier 1 decks. Like not as good as Delver, Murktide Shadow, Rhino, etc. In particular, there's a lot of cards that I feel are kind of mediocre. Whale of the Forgotten is one of them. Sorcery. None of the modes when you can't Descend Aid it are that good. And Descending Aid it is really tough. We didn't accomplish that one time throughout the. We weren't even close to doing that. Animate Dead, I understand why it's not Reanimate, because you want enchantment count higher, but it feels so bad not just... There's so many turns where you could, like, Grief and then Reanimate Grief, but you can't because it's Animate Dead. Incongruity and Turtle also feel mediocre. So it's interesting, but is it good? I don't know. I think it's also got kind of a problem where... Unlike a deck like, say, Rhinos, with all in on just cascade into Rhinos every single game, place them in an Elvish Spirit Guide, make sure you cast Rhinos. This deck is not all in on that. You only have the Bloodbraids as your cascaders. You have to set up Delirium ahead of time. You have to have a lot of stuff going into your graveyard, Living End worth it. There's just a lot of setup. It's kind of slow. So it's not all in on that combo plan, but at the same time, it's not really a mid-range deck either. If you're not cascading in Living End, what else are you? Not much anything. Like hard casting Architects on 4 mana, not very good. So I feel like if the idea is we want to, I think the main idea is supposed to be we want to be Living End in Legacy, right? Then it should just be Living End in Legacy. Just have a bunch of cycling creatures, more cascade stuff, not risk yourself to Marauder. I mean, a bunch of the 2 mana cards that we're playing. So I guess the idea is like, well, we can play Marauder instead of the 3 mana cascade cards and then be able to play other 2-drops. But the other 2 mana cards that we're playing are not even that good. Like Whale is not good. The only reason we're playing Once Upon a Time is to find Marauder. Animate Dead is worse than Reanimate. Daze is okay, but not great. We're like playing this card, which is mostly, again, just to find Bloodbraid Marauder. I would need, again, a lot more practice with this. I would need to play a lot more to really see how good it is. It doesn't fit. It feels like a B tier deck. Something it's kind of okay. Yeah, you can win some games with it. We went 3, but nothing great. Anyways, the media recommendation of the day is ADOM, which stands for Ancient Domains of Mystery. This is a free roguelike game developed by Thomas Biskup, and it's been around for a long time. You can see 1994. It's gone through many different iterations, and as you can see, this title screen is what the graphics are in the game is in a windowed mode with all ASCII graphics, meaning everything is just made up of text symbols. There is no sound in the game whatsoever. So how is the game so good when it's so minimal? Well, first of all, 100% free. There is a paid version, and as far as I know, the only difference is they just have actual graphics and not ASCII, but I actually prefer the ASCII over the updated graphics. And the game is obviously a procedural roguelike, so it changes every single game. There are things that stay the same, like the layout of the world map and specific levels that you find certain dungeon configurations in when you delve down into them. But other than that, basically every room is randomized, enemies randomized, drops randomized, and this is the game that I've seen that has the absolute most replay value of any procedural game that I've ever played. You can easily play this game for years and not grow tired of it because it is so much content, as opposed to other roguelikes where even roguelikes that I've enjoyed in the past, like let's say Binding of Isaac, Crypt of the Necrodancer, Spelunky, Noida. I do like all of those games, but eventually there comes a point where you've basically played the game, explored all of its secrets, you kind of understand the procedural generation, all the games feel the same. ADOM feels different every single time. It's also really freaking hard, like really hard. It's no saves, one life, you die, you start over. And it's long too. You can't beat it in, most roguelikes, again, like Spelunky, Binding of Isaac, etc., runs will last like 20, 40 minutes roughly. ADOM is a multi-day long trek. So if you enjoy really difficult games, if you enjoy roguelikes, if you enjoy procedurals that have lots of replayable content, highly recommend ADOM. Anyways, that is going to be the end of the Delirium in Living End. It's kind of a shame there's so many of you here. I wish we could go on, but we have been streaming for almost 11 hours, so we're going to call it quits. So if you did show up to the stream, I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I will see you next time.